Everything was quiet in the restaurant until this woman started complaining that she didn't want to be served by a gay waiter. The staff tried to calm her down, but in the end, guess who got kicked out? If there's one thing you learn from working in customer service, it's that some people really do think the world revolves around them. And this story? This was the height of absurdity. It was a normal day at the restaurant, tables busy, orders coming out of the kitchen, customers enjoying their meals without too much hassle. But, as always, peace doesn't last long when the universe decides to send someone clueless to test the patience of others. The woman walked in as if she owned the place. Shoulders high, a look of superiority, and one of those fake smiles that only appear when you're already planning some kind of trouble. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but it had a pleasant atmosphere, and from the way she looked around, it seemed she was already making a mental list of complaints. The waiter who served her was a quiet guy, always smiling, professional, the kind of guy who had seen it all on the job. He approached the table, served her normally, and took her order without any problem. Everything seemed to follow the normal course of civilization, until she started staring at his badge. It was subtle at first, a long look, a suspicious raise of the eyebrow, but it soon became an obvious annoyance. She crossed her arms, tilted her head, and stared at the poor guy as if he had committed a crime just by existing. When the waiter left to take their order, she called another employee over. Without even disguising it, she pointed at him and asked, in a somewhat conspiratorial tone,
"That boy is, I'd rather be served by someone else."
The employee, of course, didn't react for a second, because, after all, what kind of question is that? But the woman didn't stop there. The sentence was said with the naturalness of someone asking for a glass of water, as if it were okay to ask for that kind of thing in the 21st century, and it was at that moment that the whole restaurant began to pay attention. Because if there was one thing this woman didn't realize, it was that she had just created a problem, and the solution wasn't going to be the way she imagined. The restaurant was running normally until the woman decided she didn't want to be served by the waiter who had taken her order. And the reason? Simply because he was gay. The employee who heard this demand was paralyzed for a few seconds, as if her brain was processing the idiocy she had just heard. And honestly, who could blame her? The customers at the nearby tables began to look in the direction of the scene, not because they were interested in the woman's food, but because anyone who has ever worked in customer service knows when they are about to witness something historic. The employee, still trying to maintain her composure, patiently explained that everyone there was a trained professional, and that she couldn't just choose who served her based on something so ridiculous. But for the woman, that wasn't enough. She huffed, rolled her eyes, and looked around, as if hoping that someone would appear to support her in her pathetic mission. But all she found were judgmental looks and a few heads nodding in disapproval. And then came the final blow.
"I refuse to be served by him. If you don't change my waiter, I'm leaving."
Now the whole restaurant had stopped. Waiters looked at each other. Customers pretended they weren't listening, but they clearly were, and the tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. And that's when something wonderful happened. The employee didn't argue. She didn't try to convince the woman of anything. She just gave a calm smile, nodded slightly, and said, "Understood." And then she walked away from the table. For a second, the woman seemed satisfied, as if she had just won an imaginary battle. But this false victory lasted exactly 3 seconds before she realized that no one else was coming to see her. Her glass of water was still there, untouched. No new dishes had appeared. And the waitress who had promised to resolve the situation, she disappeared into the restaurant and never came back. Minutes passed, and the woman's expression changed, from confident to confused, from confused to irritated. She looked around, expecting someone to come running to beg her to stay there. But the reality was different. Nobody cared. She didn't want that waiter? Good. Now there would be no waiter, and her humiliation was only beginning. The woman looked around, tapping her fingers on the table, waiting to be seen. But no one came. Minutes passed, and nothing. No waiter approached her. No one asked if she needed anything. It seemed that, out of nowhere, she had become invisible. The restaurant continued to function normally, orders being served, people eating and chatting, as if she wasn't there. And it was clearly killing her inside. The waiter she had rejected was still working, serving other tables without the slightest problem. Did it bother her? It certainly did. With every plate that passed her by, it was as if the universe was rubbing it in her face that she wasn't as special as she thought. Then came the first sign of desperation. She started waving at the waiters, trying to get their attention, but none of them looked. Some walked straight past, focused on the customers who really deserved to be served. Others pretended not to see her at all. And then, when she realized that she was being deliberately ignored, the woman exploded. She slammed her hand on the table, causing the cutlery to shake, and exclaimed to anyone who would listen,
This is absurd. I'm a customer, and I deserve to be served.
"That's it." Now she got the attention she wanted, but not in the way she had hoped. Some people stared and laughed quietly. Others simply carried on eating, ignoring the scandal. But the restaurant staff, they didn't even flinch. She stood up, red with anger, trying to understand how she had lost control of the situation. Deep down, it was simple. No one there wanted to deal with her. And the most efficient way to make an unbearable person go away? Pretend they don't exist. What used to be a game where she thought she was in control was now a public humiliation. And the worst thing? Her food never arrived. The restaurant had made a silent but powerful decision. If she didn't want to be served by that waiter, then she wouldn't be served by anyone. And now, there was only one option left. The woman was standing next to the table, huffing angrily, while the whole restaurant pretended she didn't exist. If before she thought she was in control, now she was just another nuisance that no one wanted to deal with. Time passed, and her humiliation only grew. People ate quietly. Waiters came and went. Plates were served. And there she was, with no food, no service, no importance. Of course, someone like her wasn't going to accept that without one last outburst. She grabbed her bag, looked around as if she was expecting a miracle to happen, and, when she realized there was no way out, she made the worst possible decision: to resolve the situation with a scandal. She marched up to the counter, where the manager was standing, and began to speak loud enough for everyone to hear. Her tone was a mixture of indignation and despair, as if she were denouncing a historic injustice.
So this is how you treat customers here. I'm a person of respect. This place should be ashamed of itself.
The manager, who had seen everything in his life, didn't even blink. He just continued organizing the orders as if she were background noise. And that boiled the woman up inside. She wanted a confrontation. She wanted to shout. She wanted someone to care. But no one took the bait. Some customers were already holding back their laughter. A woman at the next table whispered something to her husband, and he shook his head, laughing softly. The waiter she'd rejected? He was still working, not even looking at her. It was at that moment that she realized she had completely lost control of the narrative. What had once seemed like a demand that everyone had to obey was now nothing more than a pathetic spectacle. She was no longer a dissatisfied customer demanding her rights. She was just a clueless woman who nobody wanted there. Then came the worst part for her: admitting defeat. She picked up her things, looked around the entire restaurant, as if she were saving the faces of those who had disrespected her, and stomped out without looking back. As soon as the door closed behind her, the whole restaurant let out a collective sigh of relief. And then, as if nothing had happened, life went on as normal. As soon as the restaurant door closed behind her, a momentary silence filled the room. But it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of a scandal that left a heavy atmosphere. It was more like, "That's it. It's over. We can go back to our lives." And that's exactly what happened. The customers went back to eating as if nothing had happened. The waiters resumed their normal pace of service. The manager didn't even bother to look outside to see if she had really left. The woman had done everything she could to be the center of attention, but in the end, all she had managed to do was make herself irrelevant. Deep down, I think that was the worst punishment for her. She wanted outrage, she wanted someone to argue with, she wanted the world to revolve around her, but instead, she was forgotten the very moment she walked through the door. And, ironically, the only person who still seemed to remember what had happened was the very waiter she had tried to humiliate. He finished serving a table and leaned against the counter for a moment, looking in the direction of the exit. I could imagine what he was thinking. After all, how many times had he been through something like this? How many other people like her had tried to disrespect him, thinking they had the right to decide who was worthy of serving them? But instead of looking shaken, he smiled, a small smile, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. Because in the end, that woman didn't win. She didn't manage to humiliate anyone. She didn't manage to stand up for herself. She didn't manage anything other than to be ignored to the point where she had no choice but to leave. And the restaurant? It continued to function perfectly well without her. In fact, it was much better without her. Have you ever witnessed something like this? Let me know in the comments. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and like it for more unbelievable stories like this one. Want to see more? Click on the card and enjoy. See you in the next video.